Maybe if you let me handle the money, we wouldn't be living paycheck to paycheck, David said with a dismissive laugh, sliding the credit card bill across our kitchen island toward me. His smirk made the dismissal even more cutting as our dinner. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah's great at many things, but finances just aren't her strong suit. The room fell silent, wine glasses frozen midair as our friends witnessed my public humiliation. The beautiful dinner party I'd spent all day preparing suddenly felt like a stage for my husband's condescension, a performance with me as the punchline. I felt the heat rising in my cheeks, but something else was building too. Not embarrassment, but a cold fury. For 3 years, I'd kept my financial life completely separate from my husband's, letting him believe I was struggling while I quietly built an empire. The truth sat like a weight in my chest. I didn't just understand finances. I owned the very building where his prestigious firm operated, along with 12 other commercial properties across Boston. My secret was about to change everything, not just for me, but for everyone at the table who'd ever been underestimated based on assumptions and appearances. But before I revealed my hand, I needed to be absolutely certain of one thing. Was this marriage worth saving? Or was it time to show David exactly who he'd been dismissing all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The beginning. I met David Miller during my final year of teaching, elementary school. He swept into a fundraiser for the school's arts program with confidence that filled the room. Tall, articulate, and working as a financial analyst at Meridian Financial Consulting. Our connection was immediate and intense. When he proposed 6 months later, it felt like I'd found someone who saw and valued me completely. "You bring heart and humanity to my world of numbers," he'd said, sliding the ring onto my finger beneath, the harbor lights. I believed him completely. Early in our relationship, David had been proud of my careful budgeting on a teacher's salary. "You stretch a dollar further than anyone I know," he'd marveled, watching me prepare gourmet meals on a fraction of what his colleagues spent on takeout. That appreciation gradually morphed into something else, a subtle condescension, as though my frugality stemmed from necessity rather than choice. When I'd inherited $75,000 from my grandmother 2 years into our marriage, I'd made a decision that would alter everything. I didn't tell David. Something in his increasingly dismissive tone about my cute little savings account made me hesitate. Instead, I connected with Emma Wilson, my mother's former college roommate and a retired investment banker, who became my financial mentor. Men like David see money as power, Emma had told me over coffee in her sunlit downtown office. The question is, do you want to challenge that power dynamic or work within it? I'd chosen a third option, to build my own financial fortress in silence. That choice had led us here, to our dining room in our modest Brookline home. Modest by David's standards, though I'd insisted on it for its investment potential. Where he was publicly undermining me while our friends Mark and Allison, Robert, from David's office, and his wife Vanessa watched uncomfortably. "The credit card is higher this month because I paid for your mother's birthday celebration," I replied evenly, maintaining my composure despite the humiliation burning through. "Remember the dinner you were too busy to attend?" David waved dismissively. "The point is that you consistently overspend. Maybe financial management should stay with the financial manager in the family." Robert, who I'd always found more thoughtful than most of David's colleagues, attempted to shift the conversation. "Sarah, this risotto is incredible. You mentioned something about special mushrooms." Before I could answer, David continued, "Probably expensive imported ones. Sarah doesn't understand the concept of Whole Foods versus regular grocery stores." The statement was so wildly inaccurate. I sourced those mushrooms from a local farmer at half what Whole Foods charged, that I nearly laughed. But laughter wouldn't address the deeper issue. My husband genuinely believed I was financially incompetent, and he had no problem declaring it publicly. I looked around at our friends' uncomfortable expressions and made a decision. Not tonight, not in anger and humiliation, but soon, the truth would need to come out. 3 years of secrecy had created a marriage built on a fundamental misunderstanding. And regardless of the outcome, it couldn't continue. "I understand finances perfectly well," I said quietly, meeting his eyes. "Perhaps better than you think." Something in my tone must have registered, because David's expression shifted slightly, confidence wavering before he recovered with a chuckle. "Sure, honey. Let's talk about it later." After our guests departed, earlier than planned, the evening, spoiled by the uncomfortable exchange, David retreated to his home office without addressing his behavior. I cleaned the kitchen methodically, each dish wiped and stored with precision as I contemplated my next steps. My phone lit up with a text from Jessica, my closest friend since college. "You okay? That dinner sounded excruciating from what Allison told me." "Nothing I haven't heard before," I replied. "But I think it's time." Jessica's response was immediate. "Finally. Coffee tomorrow? We need to plan this carefully." I smiled at her enthusiasm. Jessica had been the only person besides Emma who knew about my financial situation. As a divorce attorney, she'd insisted I document everything from the beginning, not because she expected my marriage to fail, but because her professional experience had taught her to prepare for all possibilities. Upstairs, I could hear David, on a conference call despite the late hour. His voice carried that authoritative tone he used with clients and colleagues, the financial expert, the trusted advisor, the man who knew best. The same tone he increasingly used with me. I slipped into our home office when he took a bathroom break, noting that he'd left the speakerphone on mute rather than ending the call. Glancing at his computer screen, I froze. He was reviewing a presentation for Meridian's biggest potential client yet, Harborview Investments. My heart rate accelerated. Harborview was the holding company I'd created 3 years ago, named for the spot where David had proposed. Through it, I managed my growing real estate portfolio, including the downtown building that housed Meridian Financial. To maintain my privacy, I worked through Emma's connections, ensuring all communications went through my attorney. No one at Meridian knew that their landlord was the seemingly financially clueless wife of their rising star analyst. Seeing the presentation confirmed what I'd suspected. Meridian was pitching to manage Harborview's assets, which had grown significant enough to attract attention. They'd traced the ownership to a private holding company, but hadn't pierced the corporate veil to discover me. I returned to the kitchen before David could find me, my mind racing with possibilities. This wasn't just about a husband underestimating his wife anymore. It was about a prestigious financial firm unknowingly pitching services to their landlord, who happened to be their colleague's spouse. The coincidence was too perfect to be just chance. Tomorrow's coffee with Jessica couldn't come soon enough. Jessica was already waiting at our favorite cafe when I arrived the next morning, 2 lattes on the table and her legal notepad ready. Unlike me, Jessica had never pretended to be anything other than exceptional at her job, rising to partner at her law firm while cultivating a specialty in high-net-worth divorce cases. "Start from the beginning," she said after I'd filled her in on the Harborview presentation. "How did it get this far without him knowing?" I sipped my latte, organizing my thoughts. It started small. When I got my grandmother's inheritance, David suggested I use it for a kitchen remodel or put it toward a more expensive car. "Because obviously that's what women should spend money on," Jessica interjected with an eye roll. "Exactly. When I resisted, he offered to put it somewhere safe with his firm. That's when I reached out to Emma instead. Emma had been brutally honest with me. Your husband works at a good mid-tier firm that charges excessive fees and delivers mediocre returns to small investors like you would be. I can help you do better." With Emma's guidance, I'd invested most of the inheritance in a distressed commercial property, a small office building in an up-and-coming area that needed renovations. We'd secured an excellent loan based on pre-signed tenants Emma had connections with. Within 8 months, the building was fully leased at premium rates, generating substantial positive cash flow. I kept reinvesting everything, I explained to Jessica. Each property cash flowed into the next opportunity. Emma taught me how to evaluate properties, negotiate deals, and manage expenses. When the Meridian building came on the market during COVID, I had just enough leverage and capital to make it work. Jessica shook her head in amazement. And through all this, you kept teaching 3rd grade? Until last year, yes. I loved teaching, but managing the properties became a full-time job. When I told David I wanted to leave teaching, he was concerned about losing my income. So I told him I'd found a flexible position helping Emma with administrative work. Which wasn't entirely untrue, Jessica noted. No, I do work with Emma. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Just not as her assistant. We're partners in 3 properties now. Jessica tapped her pen against her coffee cup. So when David said you're living paycheck to paycheck, complete fiction. I pay exactly half of our household expenses. From my salary, which is actually a small draw I take from the property management company. The rest gets reinvested. We live in a modest house because I wanted it that way. It's appreciating nicely in this neighborhood. Jessica leaned forward. And now his firm wants to manage your money without realizing it's you. This is better than fiction. She turned serious. But Sarah, you need to decide what you want. Are you preparing for divorce, or do you want to save this marriage? The question hung between us. Despite everything, I hadn't fully allowed myself to examine what I wanted. I don't know, I admitted. Part of me still loves who I thought David was. But I don't know if that person exists. If he can't see me as an equal, what's left? Before you make any decisions, I think you need more information, Jessica said. Find out if David's attitude comes from him alone, or if it's how they discuss clients, particularly female clients, at Meridian. That will tell you whether this is a personal failing or a cultural one he's absorbed. Jessica's suggestion made sense. I needed to understand whether David's dismissiveness was specific to me or reflected deeper attitudes about women and money that permeated his professional environment. Robert Chen, I said suddenly. David's colleague who was at dinner last night. He seemed uncomfortable with how David spoke to me. Maybe he could provide insight. Jessica looked skeptical. Can you trust him not to go straight to David? I think so. He's always been respectful, and rumor has it he's been passed over for promotion despite bringing in more clients than anyone else in his division. He might have his own reasons to be disillusioned with Meridian's culture. Careful, Jessica warned, but it's worth exploring. And meanwhile, what about the Harborview pitch? I smiled for the first time since the previous night's humiliation. I think it's time for Harborview's mysterious owner to take a more active interest in who manages her assets, don't you? Jessica's answering smile was downright predatory. I think that sounds perfect. Contacting Robert required finesse. I couldn't simply call him at Meridian or send an email that might be monitored. Instead, I remembered he frequented a particular coffee shop near the office for his afternoon break. A detail I'd noted during one of the few times I'd met David for lunch downtown. The following afternoon, I positioned myself at a corner table with my laptop. When Robert entered at his usual time, I feigned surprise at seeing him. Robert! What a coincidence! He spotted me and hesitated briefly before approaching. Sarah, hello. I'm sorry about the other night. That was uncomfortable? I supplied. It's not your fault. Please, join me if you have time. He glanced at his watch. Sure, I have 15 minutes. Once he'd returned with his coffee, I decided directness was the best approach. Robert, I wanted to ask you something, and I'd appreciate your honesty. Is how David speaks to me unusual? Or is that how financial advisors generally view their spouses or female clients? The question clearly caught him off guard. He turned his coffee cup slowly before meeting my eyes. "It's not unusual at Meridian," he said finally. "There's a culture there, not with everyone, but with many of the senior partners and those following their lead, of a certain paternalism toward women and money. Michael Thompson sets that tone from the top." Michael Thompson was the founding partner and David's direct superior, the man David constantly quoted and tried to impress. "I've heard client calls where wealthy women are referred to as financial dependents, regardless of their actual knowledge," Robert continued, lowering his voice. "It's one reason I'm considering leaving. My mother was a financial analyst who raised me alone after my father died. This attitude doesn't sit well with me." The confirmation both validated my suspicions and deepened my concern. This wasn't just about David's perception of me. It was about a systematic undervaluation of women's financial capabilities that he had absorbed and brought home. "Thank you for your honesty," I said. "Can I ask one more thing? What do you know about the Harborview pitch?" Robert's eyebrows rose. "That's highly confidential. How do you—" He stopped himself. "David shouldn't be discussing client matters at home." "He doesn't," I assured him. "I just happened to see the name on his screen. I was curious because I've done some administrative work for Harborview through Emma Wilson." This wasn't technically a lie. Emma was involved with Harborview as my advisor, but it created the connection I needed. Robert's expression shifted from concern to interest. "Really? Meridian has been trying to identify the principal owner for months. All communications go through attorneys and managers. Thompson is obsessed with landing this account. Apparently, the portfolio has grown remarkably in just a few years." "What would landing this account mean for David?" I asked casually. "Partnership track, almost certainly. Thompson has practically promised it. The Harborview pitch is scheduled for next Friday, and everyone's working overtime to make it perfect." Partnership. The goal David had been working toward for years. The achievement he repeatedly told me would finally give us financial freedom. The irony was almost too much. "Thank you, Robert. This stays between us, right?" He nodded. "Of course. And Sarah, whatever you're thinking about doing, be careful. The financial world can be more cutthroat than people realize." As he left, I texted Emma, "Need to meet urgently about Harborview. Meridian is pitching for asset management next Friday." Her response came quickly. "My office, 5 p.m., bringing Jake." Jake was our attorney, which meant Emma understood the gravity of the situation. The meeting with Emma and Jake that evening clarified my options. As Jake outlined, I had no legal obligation to disclose my ownership of Harborview to David or Meridian. The corporate structures we had created were specifically designed to maintain privacy. However, he cautioned, if you're contemplating divorce, the timing becomes critical. Massachusetts is an equitable distribution state. While the inheritance itself might be considered separate property, the growth and businesses developed from it could potentially be viewed as marital assets depending on various factors. Emma, practical as always, focused on the business decision. Meridian isn't the right fit for managing Harborview's assets. Their performance metrics are mediocre, and their fee structure is outdated. This is actually an easy decision from a purely financial perspective. But as they both acknowledged, this wasn't merely a financial decision. It was deeply personal, intertwined with the future of my marriage and my own self-respect. I need to see how David handles the pitch, I decided finally. Not just the presentation itself, but how he talks about the client, about me, unknowingly, when he thinks I'm not listening. That will tell me everything I need to know. Jake frowned. How would you arrange that without revealing yourself? I smiled. As the principal owner of Harborview, I think it's time I took a more active role in interviewing potential financial advisors, don't you? The plan took shape quickly. Emma would contact Meridian as Harborview's financial advisor, requesting that the mysterious owner would be joining the pitch meeting. All communication would continue through proper channels, maintaining the separation between Sarah Miller, the wife, and Sarah Matthews, using my maiden name, the investor. The intervening week was an exercise in composure. At home, David became increasingly tense and distant, working late every night on the Harborview presentation. When he did speak to me, it was distracted and often condescending, his stress manifesting as impatience with what he perceived as my simpler concerns. No, Sarah, I can't look at the household budget right now. Just handle the groceries and utilities like always, and try not to overspend this month. This Harborview deal is important. It's our future. Our future. The phrase echoed in my mind as I prepared for Friday's meeting. In many ways, he was right, though not in the way he imagined. Friday morning, I dressed with particular care, in my downtown hotel room, where I'd checked in the previous night under my maiden name. The charcoal gray suit I selected projected understated wealth and confidence, an image far different from the casual clothes David was accustomed to seeing me in. With my hair swept into a sleek updo and subtle but immaculate makeup, I looked every inch the successful investor. Emma met me in the hotel lobby, her expression approving as she handed me a leather portfolio containing Harborview's complete financial records. Ready to show them exactly who they're dealing with. More than ready, I replied, surprised by my own calm. Whatever happened in the next few hours would irrevocably change my life. Yet instead of anxiety, I felt only a steady resolve. The Meridian conference room offered a spectacular view of Boston Harbor, a view made possible because I had specifically selected this building for its location and potential appreciation when I purchased it through Harborview. David had mentioned working in one of the best addresses in the financial district countless times, never knowing his wife was responsible for that prestigious address. Emma and I arrived precisely on time, escorted by Michael Thompson himself, who had no idea that the polished woman he was deferentially welcoming was the same person his protégé had dismissed as financially incompetent just days before. "Ms. Matthews, it's an honor to finally meet you," Thompson said, ushering us into the conference room where David and 3 other Meridian advisors waited. "Your representative has been quite mysterious about the principle behind Harborview. I hope today marks the beginning of a productive relationship." I smiled politely, watching as David's expression shifted from professional interest to shock as he recognized me, then to confusion and finally alarm as he processed my presence at this meeting. The blood drained from his face so rapidly I momentarily feared he might faint. "Thank you for the warm welcome, Mr. Thompson," I replied smoothly. "I prefer to maintain privacy in my business dealings, but given the scope of what we're discussing today, I felt a personal assessment was warranted." Of course," Thompson nodded eagerly before turning to make introductions. "This is our team, Robert Chen, whom you may know from previous communications, Anita Desai, our tax strategist, and David Miller, who has spearheaded the analysis of your portfolio." David stood frozen, unable to extend his hand or speak. I calmly offered mine, looking directly into his eyes. "Mr. Miller, how interesting to meet you. Shall we begin?" The conference room felt charged with an almost electric tension as David struggled to regain his composure. His colleagues, oblivious to the personal drama unfolding, continued arranging presentation materials while Michael Thompson gestured for us to take our seats at the gleaming mahogany table. "Before we begin," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me, "I'd like to clarify that while I go by Sarah Matthews professionally, some of you might know me by my married name, Sarah Miller." The effect was immediate. Michael Thompson's practiced smile faltered as he glanced between David and me, processing the implication. Robert, who had clearly suspected something but not the full truth, carefully maintained a neutral expression. The other team members looked confused, uncertain how to respond to this unexpected development. Thompson began, then stopped, recalibrating. David, perhaps you'd like to explain? David's face had moved from shock to a mortified flush. He cleared his throat, loosened his tie slightly, and attempted to regain professional footing. "Sarah is my wife," he said flatly. "I was unaware of her connection to Harborview Investments." "Unaware?" Thompson's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. "You've been leading this pitch for weeks. How could you not know your own wife was the principal?" I decided to intervene before David was completely undermined. Whatever happened between us personally, public humiliation in front of his colleagues wasn't my objective. To be fair, Mr. Thompson, I've deliberately maintained separation between my personal and professional finances. David and I have separate financial arrangements, and Harborview operates through several layers of corporate structure specifically designed for privacy. I turned to address the room. I believe the presentation was prepared without this knowledge, and I'm still interested in hearing it. Shall we proceed? Thompson hesitated, clearly recalculating the dynamics of the meeting, before nodding. "Of course, Mrs. Miller. David, please begin." David moved to the front of the room with the mechanical precision of someone operating on autopilot. He clicked to the first slide of his presentation, and I watched as professional training temporarily overcame personal shock. "Harborview Investments has demonstrated exceptional growth over the past 3 years," he began, his voice finding its usual confident rhythm despite the occasional glance in my direction. "The portfolio has expanded from a single commercial property to 13 holdings across Greater Boston, with a current valuation exceeding $30 million. I listened intently as he detailed the very empire I had built, fascinated by how thoroughly they had analyzed my work. Their assessment was largely accurate, though they'd missed some of the strategic nuances that had guided my acquisition decisions. What was most interesting was watching how David spoke about Harborview's management, about me, unknowingly, when describing the investment approach. "Whoever has been guiding these investments has shown unusual insight into emerging neighborhood trends and value-add opportunities," he acknowledged, seemingly unaware of the irony. "However, the portfolio has now reached a size where more sophisticated management could significantly enhance returns and reduce risk exposure." Emma shifted beside me, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. This was precisely the patronizing approach Robert had warned me about. The assumption that a portfolio that had outperformed market averages by double digits needed more sophisticated management simply because it had reached a certain size threshold was exactly the attitude I'd come to recognize. As David continued outlining Meridian's proposed approach, I noticed Robert watching me carefully. When David mentioned tax optimization strategies that you may not have considered, Robert actually winced slightly. He knew how this sounded, now that the identity of the owner had been revealed. The presentation continued for nearly 40 minutes, during which I observed not just the content, but the subtle dynamics in the room. Thompson's repeated attempts to smooth over David's, occasionally, condescending phrasing, Anita's growing discomfort as she realized how her tax strategy section might sound to someone who had clearly already implemented sophisticated tax planning. Robert's increasing tendency to jump in with more respectful framing when David veered into paternalistic territory. When David finally concluded, Thompson quickly took control. "Thank you, David. Now, Mrs. Miller, we'd be happy to address any questions you might have." "I do have several," I said, opening the portfolio Emma had prepared. "First, I'd like to understand the reasoning behind your recommendation to divest the Dorchester property, which has been one of the portfolio's strongest performers with significant additional upside potential as the neighborhood continues to develop." David looked startled. "The Dorchester market is historically volatile, and our models suggest—" "Your models rely on historical data that doesn't account for the recent Rezoning and transit expansion, I interrupted, pulling out the relevant documentation. The property is currently generating a 12.8% cash-on-cash return and is poised for at least 20% appreciation over the next 3 years, based on committed development projects in the area. The room fell silent as I continued methodically through their presentation, questioning assumptions, highlighting oversights, and occasionally acknowledging solid recommendations. Years of studying market trends, working with Emma, and managing my portfolio had given me an expertise that now emerged with quiet confidence. David's expression shifted gradually from shock to something more complex, a reluctant recognition that seemed to war with his discomfort. Thompson, meanwhile, had recalibrated entirely, addressing me with the respect of a peer rather than the condescension of an advisor to a wealthy but uninformed client. After nearly an hour of detailed discussion, Emma checked her watch. "Sarah, we should wrap up. You have that call with the Seattle developers at noon." I nodded, gathering my materials. "Thank you all for the presentation. There are certainly elements of your approach that merit consideration, particularly in the area of international diversification. I'll need time to review everything in detail before making any decisions." Thompson rose quickly. "Of course. We appreciate your thoroughness and insight, Mrs. Miller. Perhaps we could schedule a follow-up discussion next week?" "My office will be in touch," I replied, deliberately vague. "David, could I have a word with you privately before I leave?" The others filed out, Thompson casting one last evaluating glance between us before closing the door. In the sudden silence, David and I faced each other across the conference table, 3 years of misunderstanding hanging between us. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since my grandmother's inheritance," I answered truthfully. 3 years. He sank into the nearest chair, running a hand through his carefully styled hair. "The building. My office building. You own it?" "Harborview does, yes. It was a good investment opportunity during the pandemic when commercial real estate prices dropped. The location guaranteed long-term value. And all this time, when I was talking about our finances, about managing money, about your spending, you were making assumptions," I finished for him. Assumptions I chose not to correct. The weight of those assumptions seemed to press him further into his chair. "Why didn't you tell me? Were you planning this? Today? This revelation?" I considered my answer carefully. "No, not initially. I kept it separate at first because I wanted to see if I could do it, make the investments work without your guidance or approval. Then, as the portfolio grew, so did the distance between us. You became increasingly dismissive of my financial capabilities while I was building something substantial. The irony became painful. And now? Is this your way of ending our marriage? Public humiliation as revenge for how I've spoken to you?" The question cut straight to the heart of the matter. Was that what I wanted? The clarity I'd sought from this confrontation hadn't yet materialized. "This meeting wasn't about humiliating you, David. It was about seeing clearly, understanding whether the way you speak to me is how you truly see me, or just a habit you've developed. I needed to know if the man I married is still somewhere, beneath the financial advisor who can't imagine his wife understanding investment strategies." David was silent for a long moment, staring at the presentation still displayed on the screen. "I don't know what happens now," he finally said. "With us, with my job." "That depends on many things," I replied. "But first, I need you to understand something fundamental. I am not financially incompetent. I never was. The fact that you could believe that, could state it publicly to our friends, suggests you don't know me at all." I gathered my belongings and moved toward the door, pausing, with my hand on the handle. "I'll be staying at the Harborview suite at the Harbor Hotel for the next few days. If you want to talk, really talk as equals, you know where to find me." With that, I left him sitting alone in the conference room, surrounded by charts and projections about my financial empire that he had never suspected existed. Emma was waiting in the corridor, maintaining a professional demeanor despite the curious glances from Meridian staff who had clearly begun piecing together the unusual situation. "Well?" she asked quietly as we walked toward the elevator. "I'm not sure," I admitted. "But at least now the truth is out." "Thompson cornered me while you were talking to David," she informed me as the elevator doors closed. "He wants to personally handle the Harborview account going forward, with Anita and Robert as the team. He mentioned that personnel changes might be appropriate given the circumstances." "They're going to push David out," I realized, feeling an unexpected pang despite everything. Emma studied me carefully. "Does that bother you?" "I don't know. Yes, maybe." I leaned against the elevator wall, suddenly exhausted. "I didn't do this to destroy his career." "No, but you did expose a significant conflict of interest that he should have disclosed, even if he didn't know the specific connection. Thompson is protecting the firm now." The elevator reached the lobby, and we crossed the marble floor toward the exit. I was acutely aware that this building, its soaring ceilings, its premium location, the very foundation we walked upon, was mine. The sensation was both empowering and isolating. "What now?" Emma asked as we emerged into the crisp autumn air. "Now I wait," I replied. "The next move has to be his." The Harbor Hotel's Harborview suite occupied the top floor of the renovated, historic building, offering panoramic views of Boston Harbor through floor-to-ceiling windows. I had never stayed here before, despite owning a minority stake in the property through one of Harborview's investment partnerships. The irony of using my professional success to create distance for personal reflection wasn't lost on me. After Emma left, following a detailed debriefing and strategy session for Harborview's next steps, I changed into comfortable clothes and ordered room service. The adrenaline that had carried me through the morning was fading, leaving a hollow uncertainty in its wake. My phone had been uncharacteristically silent. No messages from David, which wasn't entirely surprising. He was likely still processing the morning's revelations and dealing with the professional fallout. But I had expected something from Jessica, who knew today was the confrontation. As if summoned by my thoughts, my phone rang with her name displayed. "I've been waiting all day," she exclaimed the moment I answered. "What happened? Did you do it?" "How did he react?" I recounted the meeting in detail, including the aftermath and my conversation with David. "Masterful," she declared when I finished. "The perfect balance of professional competence and personal dignity." "But what happens next? What do you want to happen?" It was the question I'd been avoiding since leaving Meridian's offices. What did I want? "I don't know," I admitted, voicing the uncertainty that had been building. "Part of me feels vindicated. He finally sees me clearly. But another part wonders if there's anything left to salvage. If he only respects me now because of what I own, what does that say about our relationship?" "Fair question," Jessica acknowledged, "but people can change when confronted with their own biases. The real test is what he does next, whether he's capable of genuine reflection or just damage control." After we hung up, I stood by the window watching boats navigate the harbor as darkness fell. The city lights began to illuminate, creating a glittering landscape that mirrored the constellation of choices before me. Each light represented a different possible future, some brighter than others. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert Chen. "Thompson has called an emergency partner meeting. David is being temporarily removed from client accounts pending review. Thought you should know." I stared at the message, conflicted. The professional consequences were unfolding faster than I'd anticipated. I hadn't considered this aspect fully. That my revelation might not just change my marriage, but potentially end David's career at Meridian. Would I be responsible if he lost his position? The question nagged at me as I watched a ferry cross the darkening water. Then again, His position had been built partly on attitudes that diminished women's financial capabilities, attitudes he had brought home and used against me. Perhaps this reckoning was overdue not just personally, but professionally. As I contemplated these implications, another text arrived, from David this time. "I'm in the lobby. Can we talk?" My heart rate accelerated. I hadn't expected him so. Soon, had thought he might need days to process everything. The fact that he was here now, barely 6 hours after the meeting, suggested either remarkable self-reflection or desperate damage control. "Come up, room 2214, I replied after a moment's hesitation. While waiting for him to arrive, I quickly changed from my comfortable clothes back into a simple but elegant outfit. Not formal business wear, but something that maintained the confidence I had projected earlier. This wasn't about impressing him anymore, but about maintaining the new dynamic between us. The knock, when it came, was hesitant, so unlike David's usual confident presence that I almost didn't recognize it as his. I opened the door to find him standing there, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. His tie was loosened, hair mussed as if he'd been running his hands through it repeatedly. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice subdued. I stepped aside, gesturing him into the suite. He entered slowly, taking in the luxury accommodations with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Nice place," he said finally. "One of Harborview's investments," I replied. "I own a 20% stake in this hotel." He nodded absently, moving to the window to stare out at the same Harborview I'd been contemplating. "Thompson has suspended me," he said without turning around. "Pending a formal review, but we both know what that means. I'll be asked to resign within the week." Despite having just learned this from Robert, I let him tell me. "I'm sorry to hear that." Now he did, surprise evident in his expression. "Are you? This is what you wanted, isn't it? To expose me? To show everyone that I was wrong about you?" "No," I said firmly. "What I wanted, what I still want, is respect. Recognition that I'm capable and competent in my own right. The meeting. Today wasn't about exposing you, David. It was about exposing the truth." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I recognized from countless arguments. "The truth? The truth is that my wife has been living a double life for 3 years, building a multi-million-dollar business while pretending to be—" He stopped abruptly. "While pretending to be what?" I pressed. "Financially dependent on you? Incapable of managing money? Those were your assumptions, David, not my deceptions. You deliberately misled me." "I didn't correct your misconceptions," I countered. "There's a difference. When did you ever ask about my financial goals? When did you ever treat me as a potential equal rather than someone to be managed and directed? You created a relationship dynamic where I couldn't share my success without undermining your need to be the financial authority." My words seemed to hit home. He sank onto the couch, the defensive anger draining away as quickly as it had flared. "They're right to suspend me," he said quietly after a long moment. "Not knowing my own wife owned our building. It's beyond embarrassing. It's a major oversight that calls my professional judgment into question." The admission surprised me. I had expected continued defensiveness, attempts to shift blame. "I don't want you to lose your job," I said, sitting in the chair opposite him. "That was never my intention." "What was your intention, Sarah? With all of it, the separate finances, building Harborview, today's meeting. What was the end game?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself with increasing urgency since leaving Meridian's offices. Initially, it was just about proving to myself that I could do it, make good investment decisions, grow the inheritance responsibly. But when your attitude toward me became increasingly dismissive, it changed. I started seeing our marriage differently. The separate finances became a way of maintaining some independence, some identity outside of being David's financially challenged wife. He winced at the characterization, but didn't dispute it. As for today, I continued, I genuinely wanted to see how you and Meridian would approach a female client with a successful portfolio. I needed to understand if your dismissiveness was specific to me or part of a broader pattern. And what's your conclusion? He asked, a vulnerability in his voice I rarely heard. Both, I said honestly. There's a culture at Meridian of talking down to women investors. Robert confirmed that before today. But you've also developed particular patterns with me that go beyond professional conditioning. Last week at dinner wasn't an isolated incident, David. It was just the breaking point. He was silent for a long time, staring at his hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was subdued but clear. I keep thinking about those mushrooms. What? Of all the things I expected him to say, this wasn't even on the list. The mushrooms from the dinner party. The ones I said were probably expensive imported ones because you don't understand the concept of Whole Foods versus regular grocery stores. Robert mentioned how good they were, and I immediately undercut you. I nodded, remembering the moment vividly. You got them from that farmer at the weekend market, didn't you? The one who grows specialty varieties locally. You've mentioned him before, and I never really listened. David looked up, meeting my eyes directly. I've been doing that for years, haven't I? Assuming I know better, not really hearing you. The admission was so unexpected, so contrary to the defensive reaction I'd prepared for, that I found myself momentarily speechless. Yes, I said finally. You have. Why did you stay? He asked. All this time, building your business, becoming successful, you didn't need me. Why not just leave? The question struck at the heart of my own confusion. Why had I stayed? The easy answer was that I had loved him, had believed the man I married was still there beneath the condescension. But there was more to it than that. I think part of me was waiting, I admitted. Waiting to be successful enough, impressive, enough, that when I finally revealed the truth, you would have to acknowledge me as an equal. That's not healthy, is it? A small, sad smile touched his lips. About as healthy as needing to feel financially superior to my wife to validate my own success. The honesty of the exchange was disarming. For the first time in years, it felt like we were seeing each other clearly, without the distortions of assumption and expectation. So where does that leave us? I asked, giving voice to the question that had been hovering between us. David leaned forward, elbows on his knees. I don't know. My career at Meridian is effectively over. The power dynamic in our marriage has completely shifted. I'm not even sure I know who we are to each other anymore. The frank assessment matched my own uncertainty. 3 years of parallel lives had created a chasm between us that one conversation, however honest, couldn't bridge. I think we need time, I said carefully. I'll stay here for a few days. You take the house. We both need space to figure out what we want individually before we can decide what might be possible together. He nodded slowly. That's fair. But before I go, I need to know one thing. He met my gaze directly. Is there any part of you that wants to try to rebuild this? Or is the revelation all there was, the final act before walking away? It was the question I'd been asking myself since the moment I decided to attend the Meridian meeting. Despite everything, the dismissiveness, the condescension, the fundamental misunderstanding of who I was, did I want to salvage something from the relationship we had built? I don't know, I answered truthfully. The man I fell in love with saw me clearly and valued what he saw. If that person still exists, if you can see me now without resentment or competition, then maybe there's something to rebuild. But I won't go back to being underestimated and dismissed, not even for the comfort of a shared life. David nodded. accepting the uncertainty with surprising grace. I understand. For what it's worth, I think the woman I fell in love with is still there. Too, stronger and more accomplished than I ever gave her credit for, but still the same essential person. I just failed to grow alongside her. He stood, clearly preparing to leave. I'll respect your need for space. Take whatever time you need. I'll be at the house if you want to talk further. As he moved toward the door, he paused and turned back. One more thing. Whatever happens between us, what you've built with Harborview is remarkable. I should have said that earlier. You've achieved something extraordinary, and you did it without anyone's help or approval. That's impressive, Sarah. Truly. The acknowledgement, so long sought but never expected, brought unexpected tears to my eyes. Thank you, I managed, not trusting myself to say more. After he left, I returned to the window, watching as dusk deepened into night over the harbor. The city lights now burned brighter against the darkness, each one still representing a possible future. But now, instead of confusion, I felt the first stirrings of clarity. Whatever happened with David, whatever we decided about our marriage, I had reclaimed something essential, my own financial identity, certainly, but more importantly, my voice and the confidence to use it. I had stepped out of the shadow of assumptions and into the light of my own creation. The following week unfolded like a strange dream, where nothing quite aligned with reality as I had known it. After my dramatic revelation at Meridian Financial, I maintained my residence at the Harbor Hotel, using the suite as both living quarters and a temporary office for Harborview investments. The physical distance from our home, from David, provided the space I needed to evaluate what I truly wanted from my future. Emma became a frequent visitor, bringing updates on potential new acquisitions and the ripple effects of my meeting. At Meridian, the news had spread through Boston's financial community with remarkable speed. Thompson is doing damage control, she reported during one of our strategy sessions. He's spinning it as a prescient discovery, claiming they identified Harborview as an up-and-coming investment powerhouse before learning of your connection to David. She snorted, as if the firm hadn't been chasing your business for months. And David? I asked, trying to keep my tone neutral despite the complicated emotions that surfaced whenever I thought of him. Emma's expression softened slightly. Officially suspended pending review, but the word is he'll be offered a negotiated resignation with a reasonable package. Thompson doesn't want this turning into a public spectacle that could damage the firm's reputation with female clients. I nodded, processing this information. My revelation had fundamentally altered David's career trajectory, something I still felt conflicted about despite the justice of it. His professional identity had been built partly on the assumption of superior financial knowledge, an assumption my existence as Harborview's owner had shattered beyond repair. Robert Chen called yesterday, Emma continued. He's been assigned to the Harborview account temporarily, but he wanted to know if you'd be comfortable working with him given the circumstances. Robert was the only one who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with how they approached female clients, I mused. I'm open to meeting with him, professionally speaking, of course. Emma raised an eyebrow but didn't comment on my defensive clarification. I'll set something up. In the meantime, Jessica has been calling incessantly. You might want to update your best friend before she files a missing person report. I grimaced, acknowledging the gentle rebuke. In the aftermath of the Meridian meeting, I had retreated into work, using Harborview's expanding portfolio as a shield against addressing the personal implications of my actions. Jessica had left numerous messages that I'd responded to with increasingly brief texts. After Emma left, I finally returned Jessica's call, prepared for the interrogation that would inevitably follow. She lives, Jessica exclaimed by way of greeting. I was beginning to think you'd fled the country with your millions. Just hiding in plain sight, I replied, settling onto the suite's balcony with a glass of wine. The harbor stretched before me, boats navigating its waters with purpose and direction I currently envied. Sorry I've been scarce. You mean sorry you dropped a nuclear bomb on your marriage and then went radio silent while I worried you were having a breakdown? Apology accepted. Now spill everything. I laughed despite myself. Jessica's directness was exactly what I needed to cut through my own circling thoughts. I filled her in on the professional aftermath: David's suspension, Thompson's damage control, the ripple effects through Boston's financial community. And the personal side? She pressed when I finished. Have you talked to David since that night in your hotel room? Briefly, I admitted. He came by 3 days ago to drop off some of my things from the house: clothes, mail, my spare laptop. It was awkward. Awkward how? I sighed, trying to articulate the strange tension that had existed between us. Like we're strangers who know intimate details about each other. He was polite, careful, asked about Harborview's next acquisition, as if making conversation with a business acquaintance. And you? I was the same. We circled each other verbally, never quite addressing the elephant in the room. Which is? Whether our marriage is over, I said flatly. The words hung in the evening air, the first time I'd voiced them aloud, despite thinking them constantly. Jessica was silent for a moment. Is that what you want? For it to be over? The question demanded a level of clarity I hadn't yet achieved despite a week of reflection. I don't know, I said honestly. When I think about going back to our life before, to being underestimated and dismissed, I feel physically ill. But when I think about divorce, about permanently severing our connection, that feels wrong too. It's like I'm suspended between two equally uncomfortable futures. There's a third option, you know, Jessica pointed out. You could rebuild something new together, something based on mutual respect and honesty. The question is whether David is capable of that kind of fundamental change. Her observation cut to the heart of my uncertainty. The glimpses of self-awareness David had shown in our hotel room conversation had surprised me, suggesting a capacity for growth I hadn't expected. But was it enough? Could someone whose professional and personal identity had been so thoroughly tied to financial superiority truly adapt to a partnership of equals? I don't know that either, I admitted, and I'm not sure how to find out without risking more pain. You could try actually talking to him, Jessica suggested wryly. Radical concept, I know. After we hung up, I remained on the balcony, watching darkness settle over the harbor. Jessica was right, the limbo I'd created by physically and emotionally. Distancing myself from David couldn't continue indefinitely. Whatever future awaited us, together or apart, required confronting the present honestly. I pulled out my phone and, before I could overthink it, texted David. Can we meet tomorrow? Neutral ground. That cafe on Newberry Street, 10 a.m.? His response came quickly. I'll be there. The cafe on Newberry Street had been a favorite weekend spot early in our relationship. We'd spent countless Sunday mornings there, lingering, over coffee and planning futures that now seemed to belong to different people entirely. I arrived 15 minutes early, selecting a table in the back garden where brick walls covered with ivy created a sense of privacy despite being outdoors. David arrived precisely at 10, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater that reminded me of the man I'd first fallen for, before tailored suits and slick presentations had become his uniform. He spotted me immediately, navigating between tables, with the slight hesitation of someone approaching uncertain territory. You look well, he said as he sat, his eyes taking in my appearance with a new awareness. Gone was the unconscious evaluation he'd once given me, the subtle assessment of whether I was properly presented as his wife. Instead, he seemed to be truly seeing me, perhaps for the first time in years. Thank you, I replied, suddenly self-conscious. Despite having deliberately chosen a simple outfit, jeans, a soft blue sweater, minimal jewelry. "How are you holding up?" He shrugged slightly. "Professionally or personally?" "Both, I suppose." He ordered coffee from the passing server before answering. "Professionally, it's what you'd expect. My suspension becomes official resignation next week. Thompson has been surprisingly decent about the package. I think he's terrified you'll pull Meridian's lease as well as the Harborview account." The thought hadn't occurred to me, though it certainly could have been leveraged had I wanted to be vindictive. That was never my intention. "I know." His response held no bitterness, merely acknowledgement. "As for personally..." He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "I've been doing a lot of thinking. About us. About who I became during our marriage." The server returned with his coffee and refilled my cup, temporarily halting our conversation. When she left, David continued, his voice quieter. "I've been seeing someone." My heart contracted painfully before he quickly clarified. "A therapist. I mean, Dr. Abrams. He specializes in men's issues, particularly around identity and relationships." He stirred his coffee unnecessarily, a nervous gesture I recognized from whenever he felt vulnerable. "It's been illuminating." This was unexpected. David had always dismissed therapy as endless talking without solutions, a perspective I had challenged unsuccessfully several times during our marriage. "What made you decide to go?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Something you said that night. At the hotel. About whether the man you married still existed beneath the financial advisor." He met my eyes directly. I realized I didn't know the answer. Somewhere along the way, I'd lost track of who I was outside of my professional identity. When that identity was fundamentally challenged by your revelation, I didn't know what was left. The honesty of his response touched something in me, a flicker of recognition that perhaps we shared more common ground than I'd assumed. Hadn't I also been seeking my identity outside of our relationship, building Harborview partly to prove my worth independent of being David's wife? "What have you discovered?" I asked. He smiled wryly. "That I've been compensating for some pretty deep insecurities by creating a persona of the financially successful husband. Dr. Abrams pointed out that my need to position myself as the financial authority in our relationship likely stems from growing up watching my father struggle with money while my mother managed everything." He shook his head. "Apparently, I've been working through some childhood issues at your expense." The insight surprised me. David rarely spoke about his parents' relationship, though I knew his father had lost his business during a recession, while his mother had maintained steady employment as a nurse. I'd never connected this history to his behavior toward me. "That doesn't excuse how I treated you," he added quickly. "Understanding the roots of behavior isn't the same as justifying it. I was condescending and dismissive. I undermined you publicly and privately. I created a dynamic where you felt you couldn't share your successes with me. That's on me, not my childhood." His accountability was unexpected and disarming. I had prepared for defensiveness, for attempts to shift blame or minimize impact. This open acknowledgement of his behavior and its effects left me momentarily at a loss for how to respond. "I appreciate you saying that," I finally managed. "It helps to hear you acknowledge what happened between us." He nodded, seeming to gather himself for what came next. "I've been thinking about what you asked at the hotel, whether the man you married still exists. I believe he does, but he got lost somewhere along the way. I'd like the chance to find him again, to rebuild something with you that's based on mutual respect rather than the power dynamic I created." There it was, the question that had been hovering between us since my revelation, now made explicit. Did we have a future together? Or was this conversation merely the preamble to a more formal separation? "I don't know if that's possible," I said honestly. "A lot of damage has been done, David. Trust has been broken on both sides." "I know." He leaned forward slightly. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer or commitment. just the opportunity to try, to see if we can build something new from the ashes of what we had. No more secrets, no more condescension. A fresh start as equals. The earnestness in his expression reminded me of our early days, when possibilities had seemed endless and our connection unbreakable. But we weren't those people anymore. We had both changed, evolved in separate directions, kept vital parts of ourselves hidden from each other. What would that look like practically? I asked, neither accepting nor rejecting his proposal outright. Honestly, I don't know exactly. Maybe we start with regular conversations, real ones, where we actually listen to each other. Maybe we try therapy together, in addition to my individual sessions. Maybe we create some kind of trial period where we interact primarily as friends rather than spouses, rebuilding basic trust before attempting to address our marriage. His willingness to consider various approaches, to not present a single, inflexible solution itself represented a shift from the David I had known. In the past, he would have arrived with a predetermined plan, confident in his sole ability to navigate us through difficulty. What about financially? I asked, addressing the central issue that had defined our relationship. Harborview has become my identity, my achievement. I won't hide it or diminish it or turn control over to you. I would never ask you to, he said firmly. You've built something remarkable entirely on your own. I still can't quite believe the scale of what you've accomplished in 3 years. He hesitated before continuing. In fact, I've been wondering if I might learn from you. Not as your husband trying to take control, but as someone who respects your evident skill in an area where I clearly have blind spots. The request startled me. You want me to teach you about real estate investment? I want to understand what you've built, he clarified. Both because it's important to you and because, frankly, you're extraordinarily good at it. My entire professional training didn't prepare me to see the opportunities you identified. I studied him carefully, looking for signs of the old patronizing attitude disguised as interest. Instead, I found what appeared to be genuine admiration and curiosity. It was so contrary to our established patterns that I hardly knew how to respond. I'll think about it, I said finally. All of it. The conversations, the therapy, the friendship-first approach. I can't promise anything, but I'm willing to consider possibilities. Relief washed across his features. That's all I'm asking for. The chance to show you who I can be when I'm not blinded by my own insecurities. As we finished our coffees, the conversation shifted to more neutral territory, updates on mutual friends, the changing Boston real estate market, a book we'd both recently read. It was awkward at times, marked by the careful navigation of people relearning how to interact. But underneath ran a current of something I hadn't expected: hope. When we finally parted outside the cafe, David hesitated briefly before speaking. Regardless of what happens between us, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you've accomplished. Not in a possessive way, not as taking credit, but simply as someone who can recognize extraordinary achievement. You built something remarkable while facing constant undermining at home. That speaks to a strength of character I'm only beginning to truly appreciate. The words touched something deep within me, a place that had long craved this simple acknowledgement. Thank you, I said softly. That means more than you know. As I watched him walk away down Newberry Street, I realized that this conversation had shifted something fundamental in my perception. The weight of resentment I had carried for so long had lightened, not entirely gone, but less all-consuming. Whether this represented the first step toward reconciliation or merely a healthier way to begin separation remained unclear. But for the first time since my revelation at Meridian, I felt the constriction around my heart ease slightly. I turned and walked in the opposite direction toward the public garden where spring flowers were just beginning to emerge. Like those tentative blooms, something new might be possible between David and me. something that could only exist because the old landscape had been thoroughly disrupted. The following day brought me back to professional reality with a meeting Emma had arranged with Robert Chen at her downtown office. Despite my willingness to meet him, I had insisted on neutral territory rather than Meridian's offices, where the memory of my confrontation with David remained too fresh. Emma's corner office offered spectacular views of the financial district, including, I noted with irony, the very building housing Meridian Financial where this chapter of my life had begun. Robert arrived precisely on time, carrying a slim portfolio and exhibiting none of the nervous hesitation that had characterized David's demeanor at our cafe meeting. "Mrs. Miller," he greeted me with a professional nod before turning to Emma. "Ms. Wilson, thank you both for agreeing to meet." "Please call me Sarah," I offered as we settled around Emma's conference table, particularly since we're no longer in a formal pitch situation. A flicker of something, perhaps embarrassment, perhaps amusement, crossed his features. "Sarah, then. I appreciate your willingness to consider working with me despite the unusual circumstances of our previous interaction." "You mean, despite discovering that your colleague was married to the client you were pitching?" Emma asked dryly. Robert smiled slightly. "Precisely. Not the typical advisory relationship." "Nothing about this situation has been typical," I acknowledged. "But from what I observed during that meeting, you were the one person who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with how Meridian approached female clients. That says something about your character." "That approach has always troubled me," he admitted. "It's one reason I've been considering options beyond Meridian for some time. The culture there is entrenched in certain attitudes that don't align with my values." Emma leaned forward. "Are you saying you're looking to make a change professionally?" Robert nodded. "I've actually given notice at Meridian, effective at the end of next month. The situation with David and Harborview simply accelerated a decision I'd already been contemplating." This was unexpected information. Robert had been positioned as one of Meridian's rising stars, frequently mentioned in industry publications, as someone to watch. His departure would represent another significant blow to the firm in the wake of the Harborview revelation. "What are your plans?" I asked, curiosity piqued. "That's partly why I wanted to meet," he replied. "I'm establishing an independent advisory practice focused on women investors and family wealth transition. The research is clear that women approach investment differently than men, often with better long-term results, yet the industry continues to treat them as a niche market rather than the future of wealth management." The passion in his voice was evident, suggesting this wasn't merely an opportunistic career pivot, but a genuine conviction. Emma and I exchanged glances, her raised eyebrow indicating that she found this development interesting. "That's a significant shift from Meridian's approach," I observed. "Completely intentional," he confirmed. "I've watched too many talented women investors be talked down to, their concerns dismissed, their strategies questioned despite often outperforming their male counterparts. The Harborview situation crystallized something I've been uncomfortable with for years." I considered his words carefully. Robert had always struck me as more thoughtful than many of David's colleagues, but this level of self-awareness and willingness to change course professionally based on principle was impressive. "What exactly are you proposing?" Emma asked, ever the pragmatist. Robert opened his portfolio, removing several documents which he placed on the table between us. "Initially, I'd like to offer independent advisory services to Harborview on a project basis, no long-term commitment required. This would give you the opportunity to evaluate my approach and decide if there might be value in a more formal arrangement." I examined the proposal he presented, noting the reasonable fee structure and clear delineation of services. Unlike Meridian's pitch, which had emphasized taking control of Harborview's assets, Robert's approach positioned him as a collaborative resource, offering analysis and recommendations while explicitly acknowledging that final decisions would remain with me. "This is refreshingly different from what we saw at Meridian," I commented, genuinely impressed by the respect for autonomy built into his proposal. "That's by design," he replied. "The best advisors recognize that their role is to inform and support, not dominate or replace their client's judgment, particularly with someone like you, who has clearly demonstrated exceptional instincts for value and opportunity." The acknowledgement of my abilities without qualification was striking. No hint of surprise that a woman could build such a portfolio. No suggestion that my success might be accidental or temporary. Just professional respect for demonstrated competence. "I'm interested," I decided, looking to Emma for her input. "What do you think?" "The proposal is solid," she confirmed. "Starting with project-based work minimizes risk while allowing us to evaluate his approach. I'd suggest beginning with the Seattle acquisition analysis. It's complex enough to be a good test case, but not so central that a misstep would be devastating." Robert nodded. "That would work well. I've done considerable research on the Seattle market for other clients and could bring useful comparative data to your analysis." We spent the next hour discussing specifics, timeline, deliverables, communication protocols, the conversation flowing with a natural ease that contrasted sharply with the tense atmosphere of the Meridian meeting. By the time we concluded, I had a clear sense that Robert's approach represented exactly the kind of professional relationship I had been seeking: respectful collaboration rather than paternalistic management. As we prepared to end the meeting, Robert hesitated briefly before speaking. "If you don't mind my asking, what tipped you off about the Dorchester property analysis in our presentation? That was the moment I realized you weren't just knowledgeable, but intimately familiar with the portfolio's details." I smiled, recalling the exact moment when I had interrupted David's standard explanation with specific performance metrics. "The rezoning application. Your analysis relied on historical data that didn't account for the transit-oriented development rezoning I had personally advocated for with city planning. When David dismissed the property based on historical volatility, it was clear he was working from incomplete information." Robert shook his head, impressed. That level of engagement with municipal planning for strategic advantage. That's exactly the kind of insight most traditional advisors miss. They focus on spreadsheets rather than the underlying factors shaping neighborhood transformation. His observation highlighted precisely what had made Harborview successful: my willingness to look beyond conventional metrics to identify value others missed. It was an approach I had developed independently, outside the constraints of traditional financial training, which perhaps explained why David and his colleagues had failed to fully appreciate the strategy behind my acquisitions. As Robert departed, Emma turned to me with an evaluative expression. "He's sharp. And the approach is exactly what you've been looking for professionally. Someone who can add value without trying to take control." "I think so too," I agreed. "It feels like the right next step for Harborview." "And what about the right next step personally?" she asked, cutting to the question that had hovered unasked throughout our professional discussion. "Have you made any decisions about David?" I sighed, gathering my thoughts. "We met yesterday. He's in therapy, gaining some insight into his behavior. He wants to try rebuilding something between us, starting as friends, focusing on honest communication." Emma's expression remained neutral, professional, but I could see the concern behind her eyes. "And what do you want, Sarah?" It was the essential question, one I had been circling for days. What did I want for my future, professionally, personally, emotionally? "I want to stop hiding," I said finally. "Whether David and I ultimately stay together or not, I'm done diminishing myself or my achievements. Harborview isn't just a business to me. It's proof that I can trust my own judgment, make my own decisions, create something valuable entirely on my terms. That clarity is worth celebrating regardless of what happens with your marriage," Emma observed. Most people never achieve that level of self-knowledge. As I left her office and walked through Boston's financial district, past buildings I now owned or had considered purchasing, past firms where decisions were made that affected thousands of lives, I felt a peculiar sense of belonging that had nothing to do with marriage or conventional success. I had carved out a place for myself in this world on my own terms, creating value and opportunity through insight and determination, rather than credentials or connections. Whatever happened with David, whatever form our relationship ultimately took, that achievement was mine alone, undeniable, undiminished, and finally, unapologetically acknowledged. 2 months after my revelation at Meridian Financial, Boston was in full summer bloom. The harbor glistened under clear blue skies. Outdoor cafes overflowed with people enjoying the perfect weather, and Harborview Investments was finalizing its largest acquisition to date, a mixed-use development in Seattle that would mark our first expansion beyond the East Coast. I had moved back into our Brookline home 3 weeks earlier, though with significant changes to the arrangement. David had relocated to the guest bedroom while we navigated our cautious reconciliation attempt. Our shared living space had become a kind of neutral territory where we were relearning how to interact as equals, rather than as financial advisor and supposedly financially inept wife. The process was neither simple nor linear. There were moments of genuine connection, where glimpses of our early relationship shone through the complications of our present. There were also setbacks, instances where old patterns threatened to reemerge, where the weight of past hurts created barriers to honest communication. Through it all, our weekly sessions with Dr. Lydia Kavanaugh, the couple's therapist we had mutually selected, provided structure and guidance for conversations that might otherwise have devolved into defensiveness or blame. Tonight marked a significant milestone, David's first formal involvement with Harborview Investments. After considerable discussion with Emma, Robert, and ultimately David himself, I had decided to invite him to our celebration dinner following the Seattle acquisition closing. It represented a conscious choice to integrate, rather than separate, our personal relationship from my professional achievements, a step toward the transparency we were attempting to rebuild. I stood before the bedroom mirror, evaluating my appearance with a critical eye. The navy blue dress I'd selected struck the right balance between professional authority and celebration, its simple lines complemented by the sapphire earrings. That had been my grandmother's, the same grandmother whose inheritance had started Harborview's journey. "You look beautiful," David said from the doorway, where he stood already dressed in his charcoal suit. There was a hint of uncertainty in his voice, as if he wasn't sure such compliments were still welcome between us. "Thank you," I replied, meeting his eyes in the mirror. "You look nice too. How are you feeling about tonight?" The question encompassed more than mere social anxiety. This dinner would be David's first time meeting my professional circle as simply Sarah's husband, rather than a financial expert presumed to be guiding or approving my decisions. It represented a complete inversion of the power dynamic that had defined our marriage for years. "Nervous," he admitted with surprising candor. "But in a good way, I think. Excited to see this side of your life properly. To meet the people who've been part of your success." His willingness to acknowledge vulnerability instead of projecting false confidence was one of the most significant changes therapy had encouraged. It still surprised me sometimes, this new capacity for honesty about his own uncertainties. "They'll like you," I assured him, turning to face him directly. "Just be yourself. The real David, not the Meridian version." A small smile touched his lips. "I'm still figuring out who that is, to be honest. But I'm working on it." The restaurant I'd selected for the celebration occupied the ground floor of one of Harborview's first acquisitions, a beautifully restored historic building on the waterfront. The owner had approached me directly about leasing the space after the renovation was complete, and I'd negotiated favorable terms in exchange for design input that maintained the building's character while creating a modern dining experience. Emma was already there when we arrived, engaged in animated conversation with Robert Chen at a large private table overlooking the harbor. They both stood as we approached, Emma's assessing gaze taking in David's presence with subtle curiosity. "Sarah, perfect timing," she said, embracing me warmly before extending her hand to David. "David, good to see you in a different context." "Thank you for including me," he replied, his handshake firm but not dominating, a small detail I noticed with appreciation. The old David had often used handshakes as subtle dominance displays, particularly with women in professional settings. Robert greeted me with professional warmth before turning to David. I watched carefully, curious how this first interaction would unfold given their complicated history as former colleagues. "David," Robert acknowledged with a nod. "I'm glad. You could join us tonight?" "Robert," David returned evenly. "Congratulations on the new practice. Word is you're already developing an impressive client list." The exchange was polite but tinged with awareness of their changed circumstances. Where once David had been the rising star at Meridian and Robert the overlooked colleague, their professional trajectories had dramatically reversed. Robert's new independent practice focusing on women investors was thriving, while David was still rebuilding his career after departing Meridian. Before the moment could become awkward, the rest of our party arrived. Jake Sullivan, Harborview's attorney, Vanessa Mehta, our commercial property manager, and Marcus and Lydia Williams, the brother-sister architectural team who had designed the Seattle project. Introductions flowed naturally as we took our seats, conversation quickly turning to the successful closing. "The final inspection exceeded expectations," Vanessa reported enthusiastically. "The sustainability features alone are projected to reduce operating costs by nearly 18% compared to industry standards." "Which means better returns and stronger environmental credentials," Emma added. "Exactly the combination we've built Harborview's reputation on." I noticed David listening intently, absorbing the details of the business I had built without the need to assert his own expertise or redirect the conversation. It was subtle but significant. This willingness to learn rather than lead, to appreciate rather than assess. As dinner progressed, I found myself increasingly relaxed, the initial tension of including David in this professional celebration giving way to a natural flow of conversation. He engaged thoughtfully with my colleagues, asking insightful questions about property management challenges and architectural considerations without attempting to position himself as an authority. "The financing structure you developed for the Seattle acquisition is remarkably efficient," Robert commented at one point, addressing me directly. "The combination of traditional lending with opportunity zone benefits maximizes cash flow while minimizing early capital requirements. It's an approach I've already referenced with several clients, with full credit to Harborview's innovation." I accepted the compliment with grace, aware of David watching the exchange. In our old dynamic, he would have either jumped in to explain financial concepts he assumed I didn't understand or subtly claimed credit by emphasizing his influence on my decisions. Tonight, he simply nodded in agreement, a gesture of recognition without appropriation. "It was actually inspired by a similar structure used in a restoration project in Chicago," I explained. "I modified it to leverage the specific tax advantages of Washington State's sustainability incentives." "That's the kind of cross-market insight most institutional investors miss," Emma noted, with evident pride in her protégé. "They get locked into standardized approaches rather than adapting to regional opportunities." The conversation shifted to potential future acquisitions, with Marcus and Lydia enthusiastically pitching a historic theater renovation in Providence they thought would align perfectly with Harborview's portfolio. As they detailed the property's potential, I felt David's hand lightly touch mine beneath the table, a simple gesture of support and perhaps pride that communicated more than words could have. When dinner concluded and our guests began to depart, each offering warm congratulations and farewells, I found myself experiencing a profound sense of integration that had been absent throughout our marriage. For the first time, David had witnessed my professional identity without attempting to reshape or control it, had met my colleagues as people who respected my judgment rather than merely tolerated my presence. The ride home was quiet, but comfortably so, both of us processing the evening in our own ways. It wasn't until we were back in our living room, shoes off and the formal attire of the evening loosened slightly, that David broke the silence. "Thank you for including me tonight," he said, his voice carrying a depth of emotion I hadn't expected. I know it wasn't a simple decision given our history. It felt like the right step, I replied, settling onto the sofa with a glass of water. Part of this new transparency we're trying to build. He nodded, choosing the armchair across from me rather than assuming the right to sit beside me. Another, small but meaningful acknowledgement of the boundaries we were still navigating. "Your team is impressive," he observed. "The way they interact with you, the clear respect for your vision. It's a dynamic I've rarely seen even in much larger organizations." "We've built something special," I agreed. "A culture where everyone's expertise is valued, but where we're all aligned on core principles about what makes a good investment and a positive impact." "I noticed," he said thoughtfully. "There's none of the territorial positioning you typically see in financial teams. Even Robert and Emma, who could easily compete for influence, seemed to genuinely collaborate." The observation revealed how closely he had been paying attention, not just to the business details, but to the interpersonal dynamics that made Harborview function effectively. "That's intentional," I explained. "From the beginning, I wanted to create a decision-making environment, free from the power struggles I'd observed in traditional finance. Every acquisition, every renovation plan, every management decision is evaluated on merit rather than who proposes it." David was quiet for a moment, seeming to process this information in light of his own professional experience. "It's remarkably effective," he finally said, "and completely different from how Meridian operated, where posturing and credit claiming often took precedence over actual results. Different from how our marriage operated, too," I pointed out gently, bringing the conversation to the personal comparison we had both been circling. He met my gaze directly, accepting the observation without defensiveness. "Yes, very different, and clearly much healthier." He hesitated briefly before continuing. "Watching you tonight, seeing how you've created not just a successful business, but a genuine community of respect, I realized something I should have recognized years ago." "What's that?" "That your financial insight isn't just good despite lacking traditional credentials. It's exceptional precisely because you aren't constrained by conventional thinking." His expression was thoughtful, reflective. "You see opportunities others miss because you're evaluating based on real-world impact and community value, not just spreadsheet projections." The acknowledgement, so different from the condescending "you're better with money than I expected" comments that had characterized our earlier relationship, touched something deep within me. This wasn't patronizing praise, but genuine recognition of a fundamentally different approach to finance, one he was finally able to see as valuable rather than merely unconventional. "Thank you for seeing that," I said softly. "For a long time, I didn't think you ever would." "I couldn't," he admitted. "My entire identity was wrapped up in being the financial expert, the one with the answers. Acknowledging your approach meant questioning everything I'd been taught about what constitutes financial expertise." He shook his head slightly. "It took losing my job and nearly my marriage to create space for that kind of fundamental reassessment." We sat in companionable silence for a moment, the weight of his admission settling between us, not as a barrier, but as a stepping stone toward greater understanding. "What will you do next?" I asked finally, curious about his professional plans now that the initial shock of departure from Meridian had passed. "Professionally, I mean." "I've been exploring options," he replied. "Several firms have expressed interest. My reputation took a hit from the Harborview situation, but my client management skills and market knowledge are still valuable. I nodded, unsurprised that he had opportunities despite the circumstances of his departure from Meridian. David had always been skilled at building client relationships, even if his approach to female clients had been problematic. But I'm not sure I want to return to traditional wealth management, he continued, surprising me. The culture I experienced at Meridian exists throughout the industry. The emphasis on managing rather than collaborating, advising rather than partnering. After seeing how Harborview operates, it's difficult to imagine returning to that mindset. What alternatives are you considering? I asked, genuinely curious about his evolving perspective. I've actually been talking with a nonprofit that provides financial literacy education in underserved communities, he revealed. They're looking for someone to develop curriculum and training programs focused on sustainable wealth building outside traditional investment paths, small business development, property ownership, cooperative models. The direction was so unexpected, so contrary to the career-driven financial advisor I had known, that I found myself momentarily speechless. That's not what I expected, I managed finally. A small smile touched his lips. Not what I expected either. But Dr. Abrams encouraged me to explore opportunities that align with values rather than status, and when this possibility emerged through a former client's connection, something just clicked. His expression grew more serious. I spent years helping wealthy people become marginally wealthier. The idea of instead helping people develop genuine financial independence through education. It feels meaningful in a way my previous work never did. The contrast with the David I had married was stark. That man had been focused on climbing Meridian's corporate ladder, on achieving partnership and the accompanying status. Financial success had been measured in portfolio size and management. Fees, not in lives improved or communities strengthened. I think you'd be excellent at that, I said sincerely. You've always been a good teacher when you're not being condescending. I added the last with a slight smile to soften the observation. He laughed softly, acknowledging the fair assessment. Working on that. Dr. Abrams says my tendency toward condescension comes from insecurity. If I position myself as the expert who knows better, I don't have to acknowledge what I don't know or understand. The self-awareness was still new enough to surprise me, even after weeks of therapy and careful conversation. This David, who could acknowledge his own defense mechanisms and psychological patterns, was fundamentally different from the man who had dismissed me at our dinner party months earlier. It's getting late, I said finally, noticing the clock approaching midnight. We should probably get some rest. He nodded, rising from the armchair as I stood from the sofa. For a moment, we faced each other in the quiet living room, the distance, between us both physical and emotional, diminished from what it had been but still present, still requiring conscious navigation. Tonight was important, he said softly. Seeing you in your professional element, understanding more fully what you've built. It helps me appreciate who you truly are beyond the limited version of you I allowed myself to see during our marriage. It helped me too, I admitted. Watching. You interact with my team without trying to establish dominance or demonstrate superior knowledge. It gives me hope that we might actually build something new between us, something based on mutual respect rather than prescribed roles. As we moved toward the staircase, preparing to separate into our respective bedrooms, David paused, seeming to consider his words carefully before speaking. I know we agreed to take things slowly, to focus on rebuilding trust before addressing our physical relationship, he began. And I still believe that's the right approach. But I want you to know that I miss you, not just intimately, but the simple closeness we once had, the comfort of sharing space without this constant careful distance. The admission of vulnerability, the acknowledgement of loss without pressure for immediate resolution. These represented perhaps the most significant evidence of change. The old David would have approached reconnection as a negotiation to be won, rather than a process to be respected. "I miss that too," I replied honestly. "And I think we're moving in the right direction. Tonight felt like a real step forward." He nodded, accepting this measured response without pushing for more. "Good night, Sarah, and congratulations again on Seattle. It truly is an impressive achievement." As I prepared for bed in the master bedroom that had once been ours jointly, I found myself reflecting on the evening's subtle but significant shifts. The dinner had represented a kind of unveiling, allowing David to witness fully the professional identity I had kept separate from our marriage for years. His response, his evident appreciation for what I had built without attempting to claim credit or assert control, suggested a capacity for change I had been uncertain existed. Yet questions remained about our future. Could this evolution in perspective be maintained long-term, or would old patterns reemerge once the immediate crisis had passed? Was the man I'd glimpsed tonight, thoughtful, self-aware, genuinely respectful of my achievements, the person David was becoming, or merely the version of himself he was capable of presenting in carefully managed situations? More fundamentally, even if his transformation proved genuine and lasting, was it enough to overcome the accumulated damage of years of dismissal and condescension? Could trust, once broken so thoroughly, ever be fully restored? Or would our relationship always carry the scars of its earlier incarnation, limiting the intimacy and openness possible between us? I had no clear answers to these questions. What I did have was a growing sense that whatever future awaited us, reconciliation, or amicable separation, it would be determined by clear-eyed choice rather than default patterns or unexamined assumptions. The financial revelation that had shattered our marriage's foundation had also created space for something potentially stronger to emerge, if we both chose to build it consciously and deliberately. The following morning brought a return to professional responsibilities, with a video conference scheduled with the Seattle property management team to begin implementation of Harborview's vision for the new acquisition. I was reviewing the agenda at the kitchen island, coffee in hand, when David appeared, already dressed for an early meeting related to the nonprofit position he was considering. "There's fresh coffee," I offered, gesturing toward the pot I'd prepared. "Thanks," he replied, pouring himself a cup before leaning against the counter opposite me. "Big day with the Seattle team?" "Preliminary introductions and vision alignment," I confirmed, setting expectations and establishing communication protocols before we dive into specifics next week. He nodded, seeming to appreciate the methodical approach. "Your presentation last night about the community engagement aspects of the development was impressive. The way you've integrated local artists and minority-owned businesses into the planning from the beginning, that's sadly rare in commercial development." "It's good business," I replied. "Properties with genuine community integration maintain higher occupancy rates and generate better long-term returns. The additional upfront investment pays for itself many times over." "I believe it," he said, though that perspective is still unusual in traditional finance, where quarterly metrics often override long-term sustainability considerations. The observation reflected a growing alignment in our perspectives, a recognition of the limitations in conventional financial thinking that I had identified years earlier, but that David was only now beginning to fully appreciate. "How about you?" I asked. "What's on your agenda today?" "Meeting with the nonprofit's board to discuss curriculum development approach and potential funding sources." He smiled slightly. "I'm oddly nervous. Presenting to wealthy clients never rattled me. But the idea of explaining financial concepts to a community education board feels more consequential somehow." "Because it is," I suggested. "The stakes are different. Client presentations are ultimately about convincing people to trust you with money they already have. This is about empowering people to create financial stability they haven't yet achieved." He considered this, nodding slowly. "That's exactly it. The responsibility feels weightier, more meaningful. He finished his coffee and rinsed the cup, checking his watch. I should get going. Good luck with Seattle, though I doubt you need luck given how thoroughly you've prepared. As he gathered his materials and headed for the door, I found myself appreciating this small domestic exchange, the simple sharing of daily plans, the expressed interest in each other's work without ownership or control. It represented a kind of ordinary intimacy that had often been lacking in our marriage, despite more traditional closeness. "David!" I called as he reached the door, a sudden impulse taking shape. "Would you be interested in joining me for dinner tonight? Just the two of us, somewhere nice, to celebrate Seattle properly." He turned back, surprise and pleasure evident in his expression. "I'd like that very much. Let me know when and where, and I'll be there." After he departed, I returned to my Seattle preparations with renewed focus, pushing aside the personal complexities to concentrate on the professional responsibilities that required my attention. Yet beneath the strategic planning and logistical coordination ran an undercurrent of cautious optimism about the evening ahead. Not because it promised any dramatic reconciliation, but because it represented a conscious choice to continue exploring possibilities together rather than apart. The video conference with the Seattle team proceeded smoothly, my clear vision for the property's development establishing both authority and collaborative opportunity. As Harborview's founder and principal, I set direction while inviting the expertise of those who understood the local market intimately. It was a leadership approach I had deliberately cultivated, firm on core values and objectives while flexible on implementation methods. When the AIA meeting concluded, I found a text from Emma waiting on my phone. "Heard the Seattle call went well. Also heard about dinner last night. David's integration going better than expected? Call me." Emma's protective interest in both my personal and professional well-being had been unwavering throughout the upheaval of recent months. I called her immediately, knowing she wouldn't rest until she had assessed the situation for herself. "So," she said without preamble when she answered, "last night wasn't a disaster. Progress or politeness?" "Genuine progress, I think," I replied, moving to the window of my home office where spring gardens were in full bloom below. He was different. Attentive without being controlling, interested without inserting himself, supportive without taking credit. One evening of good behavior doesn't erase years of condescension, she pointed out, ever the pragmatist. "Of course not," I acknowledged, "but it's consistent with the changes I've been seeing in therapy and at home. He's doing the work, Emma. Real self-examination, not just surface adjustments to win me back." She made a non-committal sound. "And you've invited him to dinner tonight, just the two of you. That's a significant step from the careful distance you've been maintaining." "It felt right," I said simply. "We're not rushing anything physical or making grand decisions about our future. Just continuing to explore whether what's emerging between us now is strong enough to build upon." "And if it isn't?" she pressed. "Have you considered what happens if you invest in this reconciliation attempt and ultimately determine that too much damage has been done?" The question was fair, reflecting concerns I had examined repeatedly over the past months. Then we'll have the satisfaction of knowing we tried everything possible before moving toward an amicable separation. Either way, I need closure, not lingering questions about what might have been possible if we'd truly addressed the core issues. Emma was silent for a moment, processing my response. "You know I only want what's best for you, Sarah. Personally and professionally." "I know," I assured her. "And I value your perspective enormously. But this is a journey David and I need to navigate ourselves, step by careful step." After we disconnected, I spent the afternoon finalizing details for a potential Philadelphia acquisition before preparing for the evening ahead. I selected a restaurant we had never visited together, a new beginning rather than a return to familiar patterns, and chose an outfit that reflected my current identity rather than the woman David had underestimated for so long. a sleek pantsuit in deep emerald that projected confidence and self-possession. As I applied the finishing touches to my appearance, I contemplated the woman in the mirror, so different from the junior teacher who had once been dazzled by a confident financial analyst. The journey from that early version of myself to the successful entrepreneur and investor I had become had transformed me in ways that extended far beyond professional achievement. I had discovered a capacity for strategic patience, for quiet, determination, for maintaining perspective during conflict that served me well in both business and personal contexts. Whatever the outcome of tonight's dinner, whatever future awaited David and me as a couple, that personal evolution remained mine, an undiminished achievement that neither reconciliation nor separation could alter. With that reassuring thought, I gathered my things and headed out, ready for whatever the evening might reveal about the path forward. 18 months after my revelation at Meridian Financial, I sat across from Jessica at our favorite cafe, watching her review the final divorce settlement papers with her practiced attorney's eye. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the conclusion of one chapter and the beginning of another. "Everything looks in order," she confirmed, sliding the papers back toward me. "The division of assets is fair, your financial independence is completely protected, and the terms are remarkably amicable considering how things began." I nodded, feeling a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Despite months of therapy and genuine efforts from both sides, David and I had ultimately recognized that our marriage couldn't be rebuilt on a healthy foundation. The damage had run too deep, the patterns too entrenched to be fully transcended, despite moments of progress and connection that had given us temporary hope. "It's strange," I said, wrapping my hands around my coffee cup. I expected to feel more devastated when we finally reached this point. Instead, it's almost peaceful. Jessica studied me with the knowing gaze of someone who had witnessed my entire journey. "That's because this isn't a failure, Sarah. It's a conscious choice made from strength rather than desperation. You both tried everything possible to rebuild what was broken." She was right. In the aftermath of the Meridian revelation, David had initially shown remarkable willingness to examine his attitudes and behaviors. He had entered therapy, acknowledged his condescension, even expressed genuine admiration for what I had built with Harborview. For several months, we had cautiously navigated a new kind of relationship based on honesty and mutual respect rather than prescribed roles and hidden realities. But as the initial shock faded and daily life resumed, certain fundamental incompatibilities had emerged more clearly. David struggled to fully embrace a partnership of equals after years of defining himself through financial authority. Despite his conscious intentions, subtle patterns of condescension re-emerged during disagreements, not about money anymore, but about other decisions where he unconsciously positioned himself as the more logical or pragmatic voice. We both deserved the chance to discover whether reconciliation was possible, I acknowledged. And we both deserve the freedom to move forward separately now that we've answered that question honestly. Jessica reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you. Not many people would have had the courage to attempt reconciliation after such a betrayal of trust, or the wisdom to recognize when it was time to let go despite progress made." Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Emma, characteristically prompt for our scheduled meeting to discuss Harborview's latest acquisition opportunity. At 72, she remained as sharp and direct as when she had first guided my investment of my grandmother's inheritance nearly 5 years earlier. "Sorry to interrupt girl talk," she said, settling into the chair beside Jessica. "But I come bearing excellent news. The Seattle developers have accepted our counteroffer. Harborview officially owns its first West Coast property. This milestone, expanding beyond the East Coast market into the rapidly growing Seattle area, represented the culmination of months of careful research and negotiation. The mixed-use development would establish Harborview as a national, then regional investment firm, with assets now exceeding $75 million under management. Congratulations, Jessica said warmly. Seems like a day for closing chapters and opening new ones. Emma glanced at the legal documents still visible on the table, understanding immediately. The settlement is finalized? I nodded. David, signed yesterday. I signed today, and it becomes official once filed. Unlike Jessica, who had supported my decision to attempt reconciliation while maintaining healthy skepticism, Emma had never believed the marriage could be salvaged. In her view, David's dismissive attitude toward my financial capabilities had revealed fundamental character limitations that therapy might address but couldn't completely transform. "How are you feeling?" she asked, her tone softening slightly from its usual business-like cadence. "Ready?" I replied simply. "Sad about what might have been under different circumstances, but confident this is the right decision for both of us." Emma nodded approvingly. "Sometimes the healthiest outcome isn't reconciliation, but conscious separation. You gave the relationship every possible chance while maintaining your self-respect and professional momentum. That balance itself shows how much you've grown." Her observation captured something essential about the past 18 months. Throughout the attempted reconciliation with David, I had continued building Harborview with undiminished focus and vision. Unlike my earlier marriage, where I had compartmentalized my professional success to maintain domestic harmony, I had refused to diminish my achievements or ambitions during our reconciliation attempts. That insistence on wholeness, on being fully myself in all contexts, had ultimately clarified the incompatibility that remained despite our best efforts. David accepted the Denver position, I mentioned as we reviewed the Seattle acquisition details. The nonprofit organization focusing on financial literacy had offered him a role developing educational programs in underserved communities, a significant departure from his former wealth management career that seemed to genuinely engage his talents without triggering his need for status and authority. "A clean break geographically will help both of you," Emma observed. "Distance creates space for new beginnings." After our meeting concluded, I walked alone through Boston's financial district, past the building that housed Meridian Financial, the site of my dramatic revelation 18 months earlier. So much had changed since that day, both professionally and personally. Harborview had expanded from a promising local investment firm to a nationally recognized leader in sustainable commercial development. I had evolved from a woman hiding her financial success to protect her marriage into someone confidently navigating both professional achievement and personal transformation. The Meridian building itself now belonged to another investment group, as Harborview had sold it 6 months earlier when a particularly attractive offer emerged. The sale had severed the last physical connection between my investment portfolio and the painful history with David, a deliberate choice to release remaining attachments to that chapter of my life. My phone buzzed with a text from Robert Chen, who had left Meridian shortly after my revelation to establish his own advisory practice, focusing on women investors. "Heard about Seattle. Congratulations. Still on for lunch tomorrow to discuss the charitable foundation proposal?" Robert's exit from Meridian had surprised many in Boston's financial community, but not me. During the infamous meeting where I had revealed myself as Harborview's owner, he had been the only Meridian advisor who seemed genuinely uncomfortable with the condescending approach to female clients. Our subsequent professional relationship had evolved into mutual respect and occasional collaboration, particularly around creating pathways for women from underrepresented communities to enter commercial real estate investment. I texted back my confirmation before continuing my walk toward Boston Harbor, where I had recently purchased a small but elegant condominium overlooking the water. The home represented another conscious choice, a space that was entirely mine, selected for its investment potential and personal comfort rather than to impress others or project status. As I approached the harbor, I noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench overlooking the water. David, waiting in our prearranged meeting spot to receive the signed settlement papers. His suggestion that we complete this final step of our separation in person, rather than through lawyers, had initially surprised me, but now seemed fitting. Our relationship had begun and would now end with honesty and direct communication. "Hi," he said simply as I approached. He looked well, thinner perhaps than during our marriage, with a casual style that contrasted with the carefully curated professional appearance he had once maintained at Meridian. "Hi," I replied, settling beside him but maintaining a respectful distance. "Beautiful evening." We sat in silence for a moment, watching boats navigate the harbor channels as the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and crimson. Despite the purpose of our meeting, there was no tension between us, just the quiet acknowledgement of a chapter concluding with dignity rather than bitterness. "I signed the Seattle deal today," I mentioned finally. "Harborview's first West Coast acquisition." He smiled, the expression genuine rather than forced. "Congratulations. That's a significant milestone. You've built something remarkable in 5 years. Something that took others decades to achieve." The simple acknowledgement of my professional accomplishment, free from the subtle undercurrent of surprise or condescension that had characterized similar comments during our marriage, illustrated how much he had grown despite our ultimate incompatibility. "And you're set for Denver next month?" I asked, genuinely interested in his new direction. The financial literacy work had revealed aspects of his character that Meridian's competitive environment had suppressed. A capacity for patience, for finding satisfaction in empowering others rather than controlling outcomes. "Everything's arranged," he confirmed. "The program launches in 6 weeks, focusing initially on high school students and young adults entering the workforce. It's different from anything I've done before, challenging in ways wealth management never was." I handed him the envelope, containing my signed copy of the settlement papers. "I think you'll be excellent at it. You've always been a good teacher when you're not trying to prove you're the smartest person in the room." He accepted both the documents and the observation with a rueful smile, acknowledging the truth in my assessment. 5 years ago, I would have been defensive about that comment. Progress, I suppose, even if it came too late for us. We fell silent again, the unspoken question hovering between us. Could things have been different if I had revealed Harborview earlier? Or if he had recognized his dismissive pattern sooner? It was unanswerable, ultimately irrelevant to the reality we now faced, yet natural to contemplate at this closing juncture. "I want you to know," he said finally, "that despite how things ended, I'm grateful for what our marriage taught me, about myself, about the limitations I placed on others through my assumptions, about how much damage can be done through attitudes I never even questioned." The sincerity in his voice touched something in me, not regret for our separation, but appreciation for the growth we had both experienced through this difficult journey. "I feel the same way," I acknowledged. "Not just about the lessons, but about the person you're becoming through them. The financial literacy work suits you in a way wealth management never did. It engages your strengths without triggering your need to be the authority." He nodded, accepting this assessment without defensiveness. "And Harborview suits you perfectly. It always did. Even when I was too blind to see the exceptional investor and strategist hiding in plain sight." As the sun dipped toward the horizon, we rose by mutual, unspoken agreement. The moment had arrived to conclude this chapter definitively, to move forward separately toward the futures we had each chosen. "I wish you every happiness, Sarah," he said simply, extending his hand. I took it briefly, this formal gesture somehow more appropriate than an embrace for this moment of conscious separation. "I wish the same for you, David. Truly." We parted, ways at the harbor's edge. He toward the taxi stand that would return him to our former home while he finalized arrangements for Denver. I toward my new condominium and the independent life I had constructed. The settlement papers in his hand represented not the failure of our marriage, but the success of our mutual evolution. Our shared recognition that genuine respect sometimes means releasing each other to pursue separate paths. As I watched his retreating figure, I felt none of the anguish or sense of failure that conventional wisdom associates with divorce. Instead, a profound sense of completion washed over me. The satisfaction of having attempted reconciliation with integrity, of having maintained self-respect throughout the process, of having arrived at separation through conscious choice rather than bitter resignation. My revelation at Meridian 18 months earlier had shattered illusions on both sides. My pretense of financial dependence, his assumption of superior judgment. From those broken assumptions, we had each constructed more authentic lives, even if those lives ultimately led in different directions. There was a kind of success in that outcome that transcended conventional measures of relationship triumph or failure. Turning toward my Harborview home, I felt lighter with each step, unburdened not just by the conclusion of the divorce process, but by the knowledge that both David and I were moving forward with greater self-awareness and clearer purpose than we had possessed during our marriage. We had each found our true financial and personal paths, even if those paths hadn't ultimately converged. As evening settled over Boston Harbor, I recognized that this ending was also a beginning, the start of a chapter where all aspects of my life could finally align in authentic integration rather than careful compartmentalization. Harborview, my independent philanthropy work, my close friendships with Emma and Jessica, my new home, all elements of a life built on solid foundations of self-knowledge and clear values. The financial empire I had built would continue expanding, now unconstrained, by the need to maintain a false narrative within my closest relationship. But more important than the portfolio's growth was the personal evolution it both reflected and enabled. My journey from a woman hiding her capabilities to protect others' egos to someone standing confidently in her full power and potential. That transformation, more than any property acquisition or investment return, represented the most valuable asset I had developed through this challenging journey, an unshakable trust in my own judgment that would guide whatever adventures still awaited in the chapters yet to be written. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.